welcome back to Knitting 101. Today we're going to talk about how to finish your knitting projects. That is, when you are done knitting, how do you get them off the needle? You can't just leave them on there. That is not, as far as I know, a fashion trend. You do have to be able to get your projects off the needle, but of course you don't want them to unravel. So we're going to talk about a technique called binding off. Binding off is basically securing the live stitches so that once the needle is removed, they don't unravel. Obviously, you wouldn't want that. There are a lot of different bind off techniques that are used in different situations, depending on the fabric and the type of garment or accessory you might be making. So in this case, I'm just going to teach you an all-purpose technique for binding off that will work for the majority of projects as a beginner. And then we're going to talk about what to do after you bind off and you have these yarn tails left behind. What do you do with these to get them out of the way? Because obviously you don't want them hanging off of your garment either. And that is a really simple technique to just get those out of the way. So to start today's lesson, go ahead and cast 16 stitches onto your knitting needle again and work some fabric. So knit one row, purl one row, until you have a few inches of fabric on your needle. You can make it as large or as small as you want, since this is just for practice. But you do want to get at least a few inches of fabric on your needle, and then you'll be ready to practice this bind off technique. Okay, we're ready to talk about binding off, which is how we get whatever we've knit off the needle. We certainly can't just pull the needle out. When we do that, we have all of these live stitches, as they're called, and these could unravel. So what we need to do is learn the technique to close these stitches off so that they can't unravel while we are wearing our scarf or sweater or whatever it may be that we have knit. All right, so all my stitches back on the needle. This one's backwards, hang on. Okay, so to bind off, essentially what you're gonna do is to pass one stitch over another. Especially when you're just learning, the bind off can be a little tight and cause the stitches to pull inward. So many people will use a larger size needle. You may want to try that if you try binding off and it seems too tight and rigid. So to do our bind off, you need obviously your knitting needle with some fabric, your other knitting needle, some yarn, that yarn needle that I talked about at the very beginning of this series, and just any old scissors you happen to have in your house. So, to start our bind off, we're going to knit the first stitch, then we're going to knit the second stitch, then we're going to insert the left hand needle into that first stitch that we knit. So you can see I'm bypassing the first stitch on the needle and going to the second stitch on the needle, which is the first one we knit. And then we're going to carefully pull that stitch over the first stitch and slide it off. All right, so now you have bound off one stitch. You can see the stitch is there, wrapped around the base of the stitch that remains. So now you're going to knit another stitch and repeat the same thing. So left hand needle into the second stitch on the right hand needle and lift it up and stretch it out a little bit and over the first stitch on the needle and then slide off. And again, you can see it wrapped around the base of that first stitch. And that's what you're going to do all the way to the end of the row. As with casting on, the first skill that we learned, there are a number of different bind-off techniques that you might use for different kinds of garments and accessories, but this is an all-purpose bind-off that will work in most situations. Into the second stitch, up and over. Now, as I said, sometimes the bind off can be a little tight, so you can try using a larger needle. You can also just be sure that you're not pulling your stitches too tightly as you're working them. So I'm going to finish doing this all the way to the end of the row so I can show you what the next step is. Okay, so we have one stitch left on the left-hand needle, knit, bind off, and now we have one stitch left. What do we do? Use your needle to pull this stitch a little loose, make it big, and then remove your needle. All right, so you've just got this one big elongated stitch left. You've bound off all the other stitches. Grab your yarn, snip, leave a little bit of a tail. You want to have enough length here so that this can't slip out and unravel. Then you're just going to pass the end through. Pull tight. And there you go. Now you've bound off all your stitches. You can see what the edge looks like. It's again a series of little V's, kind of like the stitches in the stockinette. So that's how to bind off. Now, what do we do with these things? We're going to do something that you'll see referred to as weaving in the ends. And when we're talking about doing this at the bound off edge or the cast on edge, this is pretty easy. You're going to take your yarn needle and you're going to thread one of your ends through. And unlike a sewing needle, this is pretty easy because the yarn is very thick and the eye is very big. So you're going to thread that through, leave a little bit. And in the case of the bound off edge, you can turn it this way so you have a better view. You're going to take the yarn needle and put it under that first V and pull. And then under the second V and pull the yarn through. Under the next one, and under the next one. You don't have to do the entire thing, depending on how heavy your yarn is. You might do 5 or 6 stitches with a heavier yarn like this. With a thinner yarn, you might do more like 8. There's no rules, but you do enough that you feel certain that this end is not going to work its way back through. Then, real close to the edge, you just cut that off. And I give it a little pull, and now it's pretty much invisible. And you're going to do the same thing in the cast on edge. In this case, you don't have the little V's, but it's not really super important. You're just going to find a part of the edge and weave that end back and forth under
the yarn that's there. You can see how the yarn kind of disappears into the existing stitches. As this is the edge, no one will really be able to see it anyway. So you do that for a few stitches. Maybe one more. Okay, then you pull the yarn loose from the needle. I would maybe give it a little stretch to make sure it's the same tension as the edge. And then snip. And again, little pull to get that very end disappear into the edge. And now your little swath of fabric is bound off. No ends are visible.
All right, so that was binding off. As you can see, that's a pretty simple technique to secure all of your stitches so that you have a project that is ready to wear, and weaving in ends so that your project doesn't have random strands of yarn hanging from it. So with all of those techniques, casting on, knit stitch, purl stitch, binding off, and weaving in ends, you have the skills now to knit a basic project. You could try a scarf. It's a popular way to start, a dishcloth. Some people really enjoy those, some people don't. It's entirely up to you. But you are ready to go ahead and try a project. So now you might be wondering, how do I find a project? And so what we're going to do in the next and final lesson is learn about knitting patterns, what they are, where you get them, and how to read them. So I will see you next time.